Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Misha Glenny. I'm the Rector of the Institute for Human Sciences. It is a particular pleasure to welcome this evening's lecturer. I'm not going to give him a long introduction because he doesn't really need it. Timothy Snyder, who is a permanent fellow at the IWM, professor of history at Yale, and one of the leading public intellectuals of our time. And I'm particularly excited that he's going to give us some new thoughts on the new paganism, how the postmodern became the premodern. Timothy will speak for about 45 minutes or so, then we'll have question and answers for another 45 minutes. And Timothy, if you would like to take the stage.
So the question I'm going to try to answer in this lecture is, what is going on really? The political way of asking this question is to ask, why do we have all these right-wing parties that don't really seem to be about the past, that don't really seem to be about conservatism, that don't really seem to offer their own supporters very much? Or to put the point a little more strongly, why is it that we have these right-wing parties which actually seem to be about sacrificing yourself for no particular reason, which seem to be about suffering, which seem to be about your own suffering, but in fact, above all, the suffering of others, which seem to seek a political equilibrium in which I suffer some, but you suffer more. Why is that? Why do we seem to be in a moment where there is just so much cultish behavior, when the most successful of these movements or parties, and I'll be focusing on the Americans and the Russians, when the most successful of these parties seem to have cult leaders who are regarded as heroes, and I would venture to say, and will be saying in this lecture, treated as gods? Why is it that the future is so dark? Why is it that one can be politically successful, socially influential, without offering a future at all, or by filling the future with dark fantasies of how things are going to get worse and must be worse? Why is it, to ask just the most very basic questions, why is it that we spend so much time staring at tiny things that we keep in our pockets? And what does that have to do with the warming of the planet? How can we connect, in perhaps a slightly unorthodox way, our own daily behavior with this political crisis and with the threat of the destruction of the world? I'm going to focus on these right-wing parties, movements, and ideas because I think they lead us somewhere interesting, but also because I think they have frustrated conventional interpretations. We've spent a lot of time in the European or the American conversation trying to explain how, despite everything, these movements are rational or lie in someone's interests. I'm going to abandon that perspective completely and start somewhere else. I'm going to start from the point that if we really thought these were about rationality or they were about reasons, we would really have to note that people seem to be sacrificing their own best interest over and over and over again, that people seem to be doing things that are obviously contrary to what would conventionally be regarded as the national interest or the interest of the state. It really doesn't make sense for people to vote for Donald Trump knowing that this will mean the end of all of the social benefits upon which they actually depend, it really doesn't make sense for people to vote for Donald Trump knowing that this will bring about an irreversible climate catastrophe. I'm not going to try to rationalize this because I don't think that that's the correct approach. It really didn't make sense for Putin to invade Ukraine. We can toil mightily to try to find various rationales, various ways in which he was a rational actor, and I realize that some people are still doing this. But I think if we simply accepted that it makes no geopolitical sense, we would be much closer to reality. It really doesn't make sense to invade a country and then find yourself much weaker with respect to your actual problem, which is China. If we are seriously geopolitical about this, we have to think that Putin is a geopolitical fool. And so I really think we have to start from somewhere else. And I don't think it's rational. I don't think you can easily rationally explain by appeal to interest why Russian family after Russian family gives up its sons for this struggle. You can work hard at it, but I don't think that rationality or interests is the way to start there. So the problem, I think, with the way we try to interpret a movement around a Putin or a movement around a Trump is that we're treating all these interpretations, they have to do with an absence. So we all really should be rational, but sometimes, unfortunately, we're maybe a little bit less rational than we should be, right? I realize I'm in Vienna, so when I say that, people are like, yeah, that's just the way the world works. What's your point, Professor Snyder? But I think at the level of the social sciences, we're grappling with these explanations that are explanations from an absence. So an absence of rationality, a momentary lapse of reason of some sort, a divergence from an expected political transition, explanations which arise from something which should be there somehow, which is not there. Or at the level of the globe, the notion that climate change is a collective action problem, that in fact we're all quite rational and we would like to stop climate change. It's just that we can't find a way to cooperate. But perhaps that's not it at all. Perhaps the explanation for the rise of this kind of self-sacrificial right or our own various ways of collaborating in it don't have to do with an absence. Perhaps they have to do with the presence. So what I'm going to be trying out on you this afternoon, this evening, is a different heuristic, a different way of trying to explain what's going on, which I'm going to refer to as neo-paganism. Now, I intend for this to be interesting and fun, and I'm increasingly convinced that the things that are true are also interesting, and that being interested is a more fun way to be than being bored. But as I say this, I also want to stress that I know that I'm dealing with very serious events. I understand that it's quite anxiety-provoking to think that the United States of America is 4 months away from a fascist transition. I realize that it's a very serious matter that Ukraine is day by day suffering horrifying war crimes at the hands of a fascist regime and the citizens of that fascist regime. But nevertheless, I'm going to try to push us out and kind of give us an occasion to think differently, to think in a larger way, or at least in a different way, about how we might understand this moment that we're in. So when I say neo-paganism, what I basically mean is that I want to try out a few large-scale modes of behavior that I think have brought us to where we are in light of the way that European pagans behaved. And my argument is going to be that if we understand the way European pagans behaved, we will actually see ourselves much more clearly than we do when we start from the notion of interests or a failure of interests or a failure of coalitions. And I should say as a caveat before I begin this, when I'm talking about paganism, I don't mean the nice version, which gets filtered down to us by way of the entertainment industry. In the history of how paganism is recollected, there of course is the bad phase, when the Christians came along and treated all of the pagan deities and heroes as demons or devils. And then there's the good phase, when it emerges that these demons and devils are incredibly entertaining, and we can repackage them as superheroes and superheroines, which is the present moment. So I'm not talking about the Marvel Comics version of Thor, although I have in another lecture. I'm not talking about the DC Comics version of Wonder Woman, although again, I have done that. What I'm talking about really, and I hope what is a direct way, is the actual pagan heroes and gods who were very demanding of sacrifice, who were fickle, who were mysterious, who were devastating not only to their enemies but to their friends, to their favorites, who communicated who communicated but in a way which was addictive and inscrutable at the same time. I'm thinking of pagan gods like Odin, who kills the people he admires the most because after all they should be in Valhalla, or a pagan god like Zeus, who wants us to be stupid for the entire existence of our species, and therefore chains Prometheus to a rock for allowing us to learn something. These are the kinds of figures who I have in mind. So thinking about pagan gods and heroes, and mostly I'm going to do Norse ones for reasons that you'll see, thinking about pagan gods and heroes, what I'm going to try to evaluate is 4 areas of modern social and political life in which I think this heuristic might actually add some understanding and some knowledge. And those points are going to be value, sacrifice, charisma, and truth, or oracular truth. So, value. These ideas came to me as a result of spending some time on an island. I don't know if any of you have been to Gotland. Gotland is that very interesting island in the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Finland. It's one of these many places in Europe which entertain Americans immensely because they had a period of absolute grandeur, but it was 1,000 years ago. So that's like, if you're from Italy, you know what I'm talking about. Or a number of other countries I could name, or at least regions. But Gotland was a very, very big deal indeed from about 800 to 1,000, maybe a little bit afterwards. It was an incredibly wealthy island. It seems to be the place where the Vikings from Scandinavia, mostly Swedes, brought back a lot of their wealth after engaging in trade in wax, honey, but chiefly slaves with the Muslim world. So in that period of time, again, roughly 750 to 1050 or so, most of the silver which has been found in Europe, or in Northern Europe, most of it is actually on this one island, where it was buried in huge hoards. And there are presumably, don't leave the lecture now, but there are presumably lots of those hoards still on Gotland with thousands and thousands and thousands of silver coins in them, of antiquarian and also of financial interest. And the reason I say this is that they keep finding them in the most curious ways. So for example, one way that a hoard was found on Gotland was that children who were playing at being Vikings and camping out chased a rabbit down a hole, put their hand down the hole, and came out with thousands and thousands of Arabic silver coins from 1,000 years previous. So, but this brings me to the question that I want to talk about, which is value. So why did these rich Vikings bury their ill-gotten gains? Why are there these hoards? The answer seems to be, although we can't of course be sure, but the answer seems to be that they believed that you can take it with you. That after death, you will have access to the things that you leave in the ground. That this is Odin's law, that if you have it underground, and then after you are buried underground and you emerge in Valhalla, you'll have access to the weapons and to the wealth that you brought with you. You can take it with you. What I want to suggest is that that principle shouldn't sound strange because it's quite explanatory of the way that our richest people behave. They are behaving as though they can take it with them. And I think once we know that, or if we start from that assumption, then a lot of other things began to fall into place. Okay, forgive me if I'm now going to do a tiny bit of history because it's really interesting. The word shilling, so there was, I see some of you who remember the shilling. The word shilling actually means a piece of a ring, so a ring that you'd wear around your neck or around your arm, cut into a piece that would function as a coin, as a unit of exchange. That's the origin, the Anglo-Saxon, North European word that we have in German as shilling. In Ukrainian, hryvnia actually comes from the exact same origin. It means a bit of a neck ring or another ring which you cut off to use as a coin. And so, you can think of money as arising in general, arriving at first, at least, from beautiful physical objects which had contact with the body. Right? It's a very corporeal and even beautiful sort of instrument. What has happened since then, to do the history of money in the last 1,000 years in just a couple of sentences, is that money becomes increasingly less corporeal and increasingly more abstract. So that when I say that an oligarch has $1 billion or $10 billion, you don't in fact imagine a heap of tiny little pieces of silver cut from a neck ring. You imagine bank accounts in Switzerland or Luxembourg or... Exactly. And so I want to suggest that kind of money, the invisible money, the money which is a number, right? The money where quality has become quantity and then become a mysterious kind of quality all over again, brings with it a kind of frustration and I'm not now asking, by the way, for your sympathy for the people who have tens of billions of dollars. I'm trying to explain, I think, objectively what this value is like. People hoard it. They are unable to give it away. They can't bring themselves to give it away. Instead, they hoard it. The Gates Foundation in the United States has this idea that they're going to persuade oligarchs to give away half of their money before they die. To cut a long story short, basically none of them can do it. Will do it, however you want to think about it. They can't bring themselves to do it. Instead, they literally hoard it. They put it in places where it can't be found, in tax shelters. And then they get themselves into competitions with one another about who has the biggest hole full of silver in the ground, essentially. And this money can't actually do for them the things that they want it to do, which is another reason why they hoard it. We can talk more about that. Like the pagans, they believe in immortality. Not all of them, I admit, but some of them. And the way that they believe in immortality is stupid. I think it's much more likely that we are going to wake up in Valhalla than it is that any of these guys, by way of tubes and vitamins and so on, is going to live forever. If I had to bet on one of those two things, of the two, Valhalla is not only a lot more appealing, right? No, seriously, do you want to live forever in the company of, no, you don't, right? The fact that these guys might live forever is one more reason to like death. But it's I think it's less likely, but you can disagree if you want. But it's certainly, let's put it this way, less beautiful, right? But the notion of a Valhalla is beautiful, that you arrive somewhere equipped with all of your best things, your friends are going to be there, right? You get, I don't know, this may not be everybody's fantasy, but you get to go out and fight with swords every day, and you come back and the table's always miraculously filled with mead and so on. And and if your friend kills you during the battle, it doesn't matter because you just reconstitute yourself in time for dinner. That seems nice compared to tubes and vitamins and wasting away and becoming cynical and eventually becoming too weak to kill yourself. So But my point is, I think that if you think of the pagan version of value, you're closer to where people are who actually have a lot of wealth. If you think of them in terms of behaving in terms of their own interests or trying to achieve things, I really don't think you get very far. But if you think of it in terms of an instinct for hoarding and an unjustified belief in immortality, I think you're actually closer to where the money actually is. Okay, which brings me to sacrifice. So when a successful, which is to say wealthy Viking chieftain was buried, certain things happened. We don't have many witness accounts of this, but we do actually have one, very detailed one. If you were an important Viking chieftain and you died, you got to take it with you. Your friends made sure of that, or your clan, your followers, your retinue made sure of that. They would build a death house for you. You'd lie in it for 9 days. 9 is a magic number. You'd lie in it for 9 days. Meanwhile, there'd be ceremonies and banquets. At certain intervals, they would sacrifice dogs, hens, your horse, and put them into a pit into which you would eventually join. In the example that was witnessed in the early part of the 10th century by a very interesting Arab chronicler called Ibn Fadlan, a slave girl was elevated to the status of the wife of the chieftain in interesting ways, which you can ask about if you want. I'm going to put a little PG-13 asterisk on that. And then she was killed so that she could join her new husband on the other side. So value is not only what, but whom you take with you. And there are cases excavated where it was more than one, right, where it was a number of people who were taken with you. So your friends, your retinue, are giving to you after your death things that might have been of value, human beings, animals, and so on. Now, what does this have to do with sacrifice? Well, let's think of this a bit more broadly. What I'm talking about is, a unit which works on a regional scale. These Vikings were terrific raiders and merchants, and many of them saw an awful lot of the world. But nevertheless, it's a local, regional scale. They saw the world with a few of their friends, maybe a larger retinue as big as a few hundred, but that's about it. What are the oligarchs taking with them? What is the equivalent? What are they taking with them? They're taking with them the earth itself. That's what they're taking with them. In very much the same sense that their predecessors took a cow or a goat. They're taking the world with them, the earth itself. There's not a single one of them who doesn't know about global warming. There's not a single one of them who would deny that global warming is true, but nevertheless, quite directly, some of the wealthiest and most successful of our oligarchs are making global warming happen, and happen much more quickly. And they're going to die, right? They're going to die, and when they die, this is what they're going to take with them. We tend to think of global warming as being a long-term phenomenon associated with the industrial age, and that's of course true, but the clear majority of carbon emissions have reached the atmosphere in the last 30 years. So in the active lifetime of the people that we're talking about, or depending on when you were born, in your life or in your active life. And this is, I mean this in a very literal sense with respect to the leading figures in the movements that I'm talking about. Vladimir Putin is the world's leading hydrocarbon oligarch. That is what he is. The wealth of his country, which is also his wealth, comes out of the ground in the form of natural gas and oil. And interestingly, the rationale that Mr. Putin gives for invading Ukraine, or one of them, refers directly back to the pagan past that I'm talking about. Mr. Putin presents himself as a kind of reincarnation of a fellow called Valdemar, who was a extremely ruthless and violent Swedish slave trader and tribute collector he doesn't seem to have been married, It's funny the way these guys behaved. He got his first partner by way of killing her entire family, his second partner by way of killing his brother. His third partner officially was the sister of the Byzantine emperor. According to the saga tradition, he didn't, I'll just leave this for Q&A, but he didn't actually seem to have married her. He seemed to have done something entirely different with her. He also seems to have had about 600 concubines. So this Valdemar, who of course the Russians call Vladimir because of Bulgarian, transcripts and so on. This Valdemar, who people call Vladimir, Ukrainians call him Volodymyr. That story is the basis for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The idea that there was this guy called Valdemar, or whatever you want to call him, Vladimir, and that he got baptized, and it was exactly 1,000 years ago, and that was the beginning of a dynasty, and all of this. That whole story is basically the first 3 paragraphs of any Icelandic saga that you care to read, right? The story that Putin is reciting is about how 3 brothers, which is a magic number, come to a town, they're invited to rule, they're descended from gods. That, of course, that got cut out by the priests who chronicled this whole thing. But inevitably, there are 3 of them always. They're descended from Odin always. And that's why they have the right to rule, because they were descended from Odin. This whole business, the idea that this is a dynasty, the 3 brothers, all of this, the whole basis of what's supposed to be Russian history, which you might even have learned in school, it's basically an Icelandic saga. It's an Icelandic saga, and it describes Scandinavian slave traders and their attempt to establish political dominion and to sell into slavery, just to be very clear for all of you, to sell into slavery the Slavs and other people around them. That's what they were up to. So this war, which is based upon this entirely pagan fantasy, it's based upon a pagan account of pagan events, essentially. This is a war in which I would argue the only meaning is sacrificial. The reason why I believe, and we can talk more about this, but the reason why I believe this war is possible at this stage for Russia is that death is the meaning. That there's no prospect of winning this war in any conventional sense. And going back to the notion of interest, there is no way that this war serves the Russian national or state interest in any conventional way. It can, however, be justified if you believe that sacrifice itself is the point. If death generates meaning. So we have a war by the leading hydrocarbon oligarch, which is based upon a pagan fantasy. It's a war which is essentially for hydrocarbon oligarchy, because I would submit that his fantasy that there is no Ukraine is like a lot of the other fantasies that we have around us. It's a sordid affair, but I think it's actually not isolated. So the 2 most important supporters of Russia's war in Ukraine in my country are Elon Musk and Donald Trump. One of whom has money, the other of whom claims to have money, and that's a special case, and I'm gonna return to it. Elon Musk does some very special things with respect to Russia's war. He owns, as you might have heard, a social media platform. This social media platform directly conveys Russian propaganda about the war. It suppresses Ukrainian information about the war. But perhaps more fundamentally than that, it undermines thinking in the way that it operates. It encourages people to huddle around certain kinds of stereotypes or fantasies. And if you're following the way that I'm arguing, you won't be surprised to think that I think the way that it pushes people is to think in a pre-Christian or in a pagan way. Now, in addition to that, the digital world is connected to the physical world. This is, the human experience, so for example, the gentleman in the front row who's using his phone, he's probably not thinking now of the coal-fired power plant in Africa, which just had to get going and so that he could do his Google search, right? And in general, we don't do that. When we go into the digital world, we think, oh, here we are in this magical place where I can watch, ski jump highlights or whatever your secret thing is you do late at night, right? I see there's one ski jump highlight person in the crowd. Whatever it is you like to do, right? And we think I'm here. We don't think I'm burning down the world, but of course we are. Of course we are. All of our digital action is directly accelerating global warming. So we're involved. We are burning the hydrocarbons in that way and in other ways. We are, in other words, conspiring in a larger sacrifice. And it is like literally a sacrifice of animals. So I'm going to push this point back to the prehistoric or the pre-human. The hydrocarbons that we burn are the remains of living things. Nothing but that. The coal, the natural gas, the oil, these are all remains of living things. So when we burn for our own purposes, we don't have to see it anymore. But when we burn, we're actually burning the remains of billions of former human beings. So it's not human beings, plants, biological entities. So it all hangs together then, right? There's this larger act of sacrifice, which I put to you in a kind of conceptual way, but you can actually see it quite specifically and concretely in the examples of the war in Ukraine, the digital support of the war in Ukraine, the two particular oligarchs who are very central for this war in Ukraine. They might die, and I shouldn't say might, they will die, but when they do die, they are taking the world with them, and the war in Ukraine is a kind of preview of what the world going down might look like. So the world goes with them, but of course, we are also going with them, right? At least on present trends. It's very nice and air-conditioned here inside, but outside it's a ridiculous temperature, and this is part of a worldwide phenomenon which is accelerating, right? We are also going along with them. They are making life as such much nastier, much more brutal, and shorter. We are all of us, we're all the slave girl who's strangled and thrown in the pit. That's who we are. Okay, Trump. Trump is a special case, and I think he teaches us something else about sacrifice, which is very interesting. The god of goats, or the god of cows, I'm going to let you in on something. They don't actually have any goats or cows, except for the ones you give them, right? So when you, not that you actually do this, but when you go home, you kill a cow, you kill a goat, you sacrifice it in your bathtub, and then you burn it on your porch. Then the god of goats and cows has goats and cows, right? The god of goats and cows is only the god of goats and cows because of you. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of worldviews crash around me, but this is the way that it works. It's the same with Trump's billions of dollars, right? Trump does not, in fact, have billions of dollars. He doesn't have any money at all. He's probably, every single one of you, in fact, has more money than Donald Trump, most likely, because he has layers and layers and layers and layers of debt, which you don't. I mean, oh, that reminds me. I have a bunch of books, of my own, which I was going to give away afterwards. So if you're young and poor and have layers and layers and layers of debt, please come to the front of the line. Okay. All right. So Trump, there's a kind of magic around Trump, which is that if you rationally thought he was a billionaire and he asked you for money, you would say, you don't need my money because you're a billionaire. But incredibly, none of his supporters has ever had that thought, right? Instead, they make offerings to him, right? They offer to him things that matter to them. The $5, the $1, the $10 matters, in fact, to them. They're going to miss that money. It matters to them, but not to him. Right? So they sacrifice things to him, and by doing so, they create this god, this billionaire god, right? Otherwise, the billionaire god doesn't exist. It's precisely the sacrifice that does it. And I think, and I'm now coming towards the next argument, I think that the appeal of that, it's a little bit like the appeal of betting or the appeal of gambling, is that when you give money to the billionaire god, sometimes he favors you, and sometimes he does not. And that's why the little sacrifices are so attractive, right? Sometimes the billionaire god, sometimes then something good will happen, but then other times it doesn't, and so we have to just keep giving and keep trying, and we become addicted to the whole process. Which brings me to charisma. My definition of charisma is the ability to tell a big lie and make it true. So, if we look back at the pagan days, which, as I hope you'll agree with me, included much more interesting big lies than the ones we have now. Odin isn't really telling the truth probably about Valhalla, right? But nevertheless, it can structure your whole life and even the way that you die, right? The claim to be a god is, probably not true. Probably it's not true. But our oligarchs, in various ways, are making these kinds of claims. If not to be gods, then at least to be something like heroes. There's a kind of sublimated version of this in the libertarianism of the United States, where our oligarchs tend to, in one way or another, put forward a view called libertarianism. The idea of libertarianism, in case you don't know, is that so long as everybody behaves as badly as possible, it'll be good for us all in the end. That is a religious view. It is literally historically a religious view. That's a view that the 18th century liberals in the Anglo-Saxon tradition hoped was true. Like, they hoped that if I behave selfishly, that's what God wants me to do, and therefore it must turn out somehow in the end. And that's become the basis of this libertarian political view. It's a religious view. The idea that a billionaire who has $20 billion and behaves greedily hoards his money, digs a hole figuratively in the ground and leaves it there, is somehow doing something which will then turn out to somehow be best for everyone else involved. It's a religious view. And it's a religious view in which the billionaire himself is figuring as a kind of hero. Putin, his whole idea that he's Vladimir and that guy 1,000 years ago was Vladimir, that they have the same name, they have the mission, this is also a religious view. And in my book, Road to Unfreedom, I describe more of how the religious view works. Trump, there's so much to read about Trump, and I don't blame you for not knowing all of it, but one of the things that Trump does routinely is claim to be Jesus. I'm just flat out. It's not like a subtle, oh, I've also suffered. He says he's Jesus. He also says that if he removes his shirt, you'll see beautiful scars that reveal his suffering. That's not quite as big of a lie as the kind that I'm talking about, but it's a pretty big, I think. The idea that beauty would ensue, that's at least a medium-sized lie. So charisma means telling a big lie about heroism or divinity, but it's a lie that comes to life. It's a lie in which people live. And I think the last 10 years have very much shown that we are capable of this. A lot of us, Americans, Russians, and other people, are living inside big lies. You know what these big lies are. Trump's biggest lie is that he won the American election, which has created a dimension of reality along which many, many millions of people live. Putin's big lie, or one of them, is that Ukraine does not exist, right? And that's created a dimension along which many people are living. Trump describes the people who took part in his coup attempt in 2021 as martyrs. Over and over again, that same word. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church is now claiming that Russian soldiers who died, killed too, but who died, are literally being reincarnated. So they're not, in fact, dying. They're coming back to life because of their Christian behavior. Now, so the point of these lies, though, as you've I'm sure understood, is that it's not just a falsehood, or it's not just a view, an opinion. It's a way of life. It's like a dimension. It's as though if you're doing math and you're charting an X dimension and a Y dimension, but then you also suddenly, you're using imaginary numbers, and so you have, is anybody following this? Yay! I'm doing this for you in the back, Nastya. Okay, so you think you have everything on the X and Y axis, but then suddenly there are imaginary numbers, right? And you have to have an I axis. It's a little bit like that. Like suddenly there's another dimension, and the people who are living on that I axis are looking on the X and Y axis much the same way that we're looking on the I axis, right? They think that what we're doing is imaginary, made up, based on a big lie in which we're too naive and helpless to understand. So truth then, or oracular truth, is my last dimension, and then we'll be done. Musk is another big liar. He lies a lot, but it's not so much that he has a big lie of his own, it's that he's a sort of father of lies. That the technology, not only him of course, but we're going to stick with him, the technology that he has brought into our lives, along with others, allows lies to spread. So Twitter essentially denies climate change for us. Twitter essentially justifies the war in Russia for us. But it's more than that. It's a generator of lying as such. And again, not just Twitter, Facebook functions much the same way as do other things. It has a kind of chutzpah which no human being could really have. The screen can lie to you emotionlessly and totally in a way that another human being would have difficulty doing. It can also do it repeatedly. And unlike most other human beings, the screen is also very, very good at figuring out the lie that's going to fit you, the thing that you're going to believe, the thing that's going to continue to attract your attention. So to make this point, I just want to return to the idea of sacrifice. The logic of sacrifice is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but you've done this dramatic thing. You've killed your child, or you've killed an animal. It's often your child. You've killed your child. You've done this very dramatic thing. So therefore, there must be a sense to it, right? You've involved in it with your blood. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You're addicted to it. What's the logic, now moving to something else, of oracular truth? If we're in a pagan world and we're going to see a seer, right? We're going to see a prophet. We're going to see a sibyl, someone who can tell us the future. Again, it's very similar. We really want the truth. It's really important to us, and we're going to believe what the oracle tells us. What the oracle tells us is sometimes true, it's sometimes not. It leads us off in a certain direction where we end up doing things. It involves you, it tracks your nature. Now, the reason that I'm dwelling on this, on the logic of sacrifice and on the logic of the oracle, is that it's the same as the logic of behaviorism. The way that behaviorism works is that I sometimes give you what you want. I sometimes don't. You don't know the logic behind it, and so you keep coming back. And the behaviorism, the behaviorist experiments which were carried out on animals in the middle of the 20th century are the fundamental basis of the algorithms which now organize our everyday cognition, emotion, and so on. That logic, so it literally comes from pigeons and rats. It comes from experiments where a pigeon would peck on a lever, and sometimes they'd get food and sometimes they wouldn't. And people realized, aha, that's fascinating. The pigeon will keep doing that. That is the base. I mean, I realize this is very disappointing because we like to think we're smarter than pigeons, but if we were, why do they outnumber us? And why do they seem to enjoy Vienna so much more than the locals? They do. You never see Wiener Kant in a pigeon, right? They're happy. Okay. They're especially happy because no one's sacrificing them anymore. They're like, postmodernity is great. So the point is that the algorithm, like the invisible thing, which is drawing you in, which you're following, functions a lot like, I think, the logic of sacrifice or the logic of an oracle. You believe in the truth of the things you find there. You're searching for truth, and you believe in the truth of the thing that you find there. But I think the reason why you believe in them has to do with the way that you're being manipulated by this sometimes yes and sometimes no. Which brings me to the claim I'm going to make about your iPhone. I think it's really like I put my iPhone in my bag as I always do. I was going to bring it out triumphantly and have a prop. Okay, fine. So I'll take your phone. So what is this thing actually? right? What is this actually? What is it really? And what are we doing when we look at it? What is in fact going on? What is actually going on? Where are you looking when you're looking at your phone? What is the object at the other end that you're looking at your phone? Where is the place that you're looking at? That what we're looking at is high technology, right? It's like this is an incredible technological thing. And as a result, it must be a site of reason, right? It must be somehow making us smarter, informing us. All of the studies, of course, are on the other side. We are losing IQ points. Sorry. But we are dropping IQ points, I don't know, like a truck driving down the road with its back door open. We're dropping IQ points fast. I realize not everybody likes the IQ test. Pick another test. We're doing worse on that too. We are getting dumber in every measurable way. And we're also getting to the point where we're so dumb that we're going to be upset when people say we're dumb. Some of you may have crossed that line. But this thing that we're looking at is definitely not making us smarter, right? I think the thing that we're looking at is not really a site of high technology. It takes technology to make it work, but of course it also takes technology to burn a fire, in a pagan temple where the oracle is there. I don't think that's really it. It's certainly not a site of reason. I think it's an oracle. I think your phone is an oracle. I think you go to it for the truths that you want, and it answers you in the obscurities that motivate you. I think it's an oracle. I think that's fundamentally what it is. And I think all the time that we're spending with our phones is fundamentally pagan time. I think it's time which is returning us to pagan ways of understanding and living. I think it's fundamentally an oracle. And the thing about this oracle is that there's no algorithm for truth. There's no algorithm for truth. Mathematical truth, sure, but there's no algorithm for social truth, for any other sort of truth, historical truth. And I don't believe there ever will be. I don't think the fact that AI spits out the most ridiculous nonsense about every historical question is a temporary bug. I think that's a feature. I don't think that's ever going to change. I don't think there is an algorithm for truth. There's a drama called Cassandra by the Ukrainian writer Lesy Ukrainka, in which there are two prophets, Cassandra and her brother Helenus. And Helenus is a survivor. He always tells people what they want to hear. And he thinks this is what prophecy is. Cassandra, as you will know, always tells the truth and she's always right. But nobody ever listens to her, right? And this is how our oracle works. There's a Cassandra problem. The truth is out there, but your phone is an oracle of the Hellenist type and not of the Cassandra type. The phone is never going to tell you a difficult truth. The phone is going to adjust to the things that you want to be, and it's going to send you out on mysterious missions, which I don't think really are your own. So just to bring this to a close, what I've been trying to do is explain, or offer a new heuristic to explain how we got to where we are, how we got to this world where you can be a wealthy leader and promise nothing but pain, how we got to this place where climate change seems to be accelerating, even though we all know exactly what it is that we ought to be doing. How we got to this world where, there are three very familiar root problems: wealth, right, which I've talked about in terms of value, sacrifice, which I've talked about in terms of hydrocarbons, charisma, which I've talked about in terms of tech. What I want to say about all this is that the argument that I've made, which, by the way, you don't have to buy, I'm happy to talk about it, but the argument that I've made about how we've reached this place where we have sacrifice of ourselves, of the earth, of our species, which is entirely senseless, where we've reached this place where charisma is almost entirely a matter of having the biggest lies, where we've reached this place where value is senseless, even for the people who have the most of it, perhaps especially for them. That this is a place where we need the humanities to help us. So it's a great pleasure to be asked to speak here at my home institution, or one of my home institutions, the Institute for Human Sciences. And I'm very grateful to the staff for allowing this to happen, and to Misha for organizing the conversation which we're about to have. But the point I want to land on is, whether you buy this argument that I'm making or not, I couldn't have said any of it without the history of literature, without the history of philosophy, without archaeology, without the history of myth, without a whole series of fields which are being trampled on, suppressed, and essentially destroyed. And the kind of argument that I'm making, I'm not going to insist on this particular argument, but the kind of argument that I'm making, the sort of thing which helps us to make sense of ourselves, is going to depend on the humanities. Part of the crisis that we're facing is the suppression of the humanities. Insofar as we're able to crawl ourselves back into at least having a pretense of giving a lecture or writing a book about what's going on, it's going to be thanks to the humanities. That's where I wanted to land. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for that talk, which was simultaneously provocative and entertaining, and I like the entertaining bit always in your lectures. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, pose a couple of things to you before, but I want to get over to the audience as soon as possible. Just looking through your four categories of value, sacrifice, charisma, and truth. These, of course, could also be applied to organized religion, post-paganism, as it were. And I just wondered whether there was a specific thing that identifies your observations as pagan as opposed to established Christian or Judaic religions in particular. That's the first question. And then secondly, I've got a very specific one about Elon Musk and Ukraine. Because, of course, at the beginning of the war, Elon Musk supported Ukraine and gave them access to Starlink initially for no money, then for money, and then basically he switched. And I'm just wondering, in your interpretation of Musk, what is going on there? Does he think that Ukraine is not charismatic or not interesting enough, and that Putin is actually much more to his liking? He's a difficult person to interpret in a certain sense because he engages in contradictory behavior a lot of the time, and I just wonder whether, I mean, I agree with you in general that he's a fundamentally negative phenomenon on this earth. I just wonder whether it is quite so easy to categorize him and his behavior and to understand what's going on in that weird head of his. So those are the two things that I would ask. But as I say, I want to bring in the audience as soon as possible, so I don't feel you have to dwell on my questions particularly.
Yeah, I mean, on Musk, I have to stop at the horizon of my own knowledge, which has to do with the platform rather than the man. Mm-hmm. You're right, of course, that his position as expressed on the platform has changed over time, and the things that he says about Ukraine have changed drastically over time. A couple things we know happened. One of them you could put in the framework of my argument by saying that the pagan gods have relationships with one another. They're often jealous rivalries, or marrying each other's wives, or that seems, I don't know. But they regard one another as different from the rest of us. It's fair to say, in general. And by the way, all of you nice billionaires who are watching, I don't mean you, of course. And Musk had an encounter with Putin, and that was meaningful to him. And an encounter and so we can talk about how he was played or not played, but I think that he met someone who he regarded as being of his own rank or even higher, was meaningful. And Ukraine can't actually provide something like that, right? I mean, Putin has, nobody knows whether it's 100 billion or 200 billion, but he has an absurd amount of money. And then the second thing which we know happened is that he got afraid. And part of the problem with these characters is that they don't have anybody around them who can help them process, difficult moments. So it's probably connected to the first thing, but he got afraid of the Third World War and needed to save the rest of us from it. Which if you're a god, you can do, right? And in his view, he did save us all from the Third World War. Right, so he believes that he did something very good by cutting Ukrainians off from Starlink in, September or October, in fall of 2022. In fact, that was the moment when Ukraine could have won the war, and a lot of the rest of this wouldn't have then happened, in my view, and not only in my view. But he allowed himself to be scared, and he took a position from a sort of Parnassus of I know I'm doing the right thing. On Judeo-Christian religion, yeah, I agree, and I was trying very hard to kind of stay on the other side of that, just because I think it's interesting to talk about. I just think it's interesting to talk about a Europe before Christianity. I didn't say this, but like part of my introduction was going to be about how we're stuck a bit in Christianity, and then Christianity giving way to Enlightenment or secularism. And whereas what I want to suggest, the reason why I talk about postmodern and premodern, what I wanted to suggest is that there are all sorts of continuities which go back through all of that. I didn't really have time to talk about that. But I wanted to stress the paganist part, partly because I think it's interesting, and it's things that often it's things that, with the paganism and the myths, it's often things that we know, but that we don't apply or we don't think have any kind of contemporary relevance. But so I do think it's very relevant. And let me just finish the anecdote about Gotland. So Gotland, of course, converted at a certain point. And there's a church in Gotland in a village which is called Garda. And Garda is what the Scandinavians called Rus. Gardariki or Garda. And those, by the way, are the names that we should all know, like the Slavic ones are much. We should all be talking about Holmgard and think places like this when we talk about this ancient Kievan Rus place. But so they convert at some point, and when they convert, they build this church which still stands. It's quite beautiful. You can go and see it, where they knocked down the picture stones. So Gotland has not only most of the silver, it has almost all of the picture stones, not rune stones, but stones which have pictorial representations of what sometimes are clearly Norse myths, which I tend to think the point of was that you could stand next to them and tell the whole story by gesturing to them, whether you didn't need literacy for that, right? So like 97 out of 100 roughly of those picture stones are on Gotland. They knocked them down and they used them to build the church, right, which is symbolic enough. And then the patron saints of this church are Boris and Gleb. And again, Boris and Gleb, I'm sure weren't they had Scandinavian names. Those Scandinavian names were suppressed. Anyway, the saint, now I'm only talking to the Ukrainians because no one else has any idea what the hell I'm talking about. But Boris and Gleb were the national saints of Kiev and Rus. The only thing they did was get killed. That's all we know about them is they got killed. But in Christianity, suddenly getting killed is a good thing. In the Viking, because Boris and Gleb were Vikings who lost. In Yaroslav, if you insist, Yaroslav was a Viking who won. They were Vikings who lost. And in the Viking ethic, the ones who lost are the bad guys. And the one who wins is obviously the good guy, right? That's obvious. But when Christianity comes in, they flip it around, and suddenly Boris and Gleb are the saints. Because they got killed, therefore they're good, therefore they're the martyrs. But the problem with that, of course, and again I'm going to cite Leslie Ukrenka, who has a wonderful thing called, the Mad Woman, something like that, about the encounter of Miriam and Jesus, where she makes the point, or Miriam makes the point, Leslie Ukrenka makes the point that Jesus sacrificing himself for all of us is still human sacrifice. It's still human sacrifice. And so imitating Jesus is still sacrificing yourself, and that maybe we needed some other kind of ethic. So I mean, I believe that this transition from paganism into Christianity, and that the notion of a single sacrifice brings along with it a lot of the syndromes that I was talking about, and that you could run this argument as Christofascism as well. I didn't want to do that because Christofascism has been one of my heuristics for a long time. So I wanted to say something which is, a little more deeply rooted and interesting. But I would not say oh, it is paganism, but it's not Christianity. I agree with you.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, now I'm going to ask you, when you ask a question, to say who you are. I'm somewhat short-sighted, so I may well not recognize you. So I'm just going to point at people when their hands go up, and don't be offended if I don't recognize you, but I know you. So in the front, and if you were able to announce yourself, that would be very helpful.
Yes, my name's Jeff Manners. I'm not an academic. I'm a retired insurance executive.
That's a seriously pagan profession.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, you've given a splendid explanation to tell us where we are and how we've gotten there. You've mentioned the humanities is the key to your understanding and possibly how to get out of here. But yeah, how do we move on beyond this, one as individuals and as society? Any recommendations? I feel lost at this point.
Oh, sorry. This was supposed to be fun. I mean, because we know it's a disaster, but maybe we can put a more interesting, construction on the disaster. But I agree with you. It actually wasn't meant to just be interesting. It was meant to be helpful, because there are constructions that one puts on the disaster which are, as you say, very fatalistic, or we feel doomed. And I don't personally think that has to be the case at all. I think these right-wing movements that I'm talking about can and will lose, or they will lose if we do the right things. I think global warming could actually be stopped rather easily if we could get ourselves together and apply the right tech. I don't think any of this is inevitable. That's just the first thing that I wanted to say. This is not like Ragnarok. I don't think that it has to. I don't think the Fenrir wolf is going to come and swallow me before this is all over, et cetera, et cetera. Second point. This is actually where I wanted to go, but I didn't have time, so I just wrapped it where I wrapped it. But I was going to make a point in the end about the difference between rationality and freedom. So I think a lot of our problem today has to do with a very narrow notion of rationality, which allows all of this sort of pagan nonsense that I'm talking about to somehow seem normal. So we think of rationality meaning doing the thing which is in your interest at that moment, and yet somehow that version of rationality ends up generating a cult. We have all these people who sell best-selling books for basically telling you be rational, and their version of rationality also tends to involve white guys 45 plus saying I'm rational and the rest of you are very emotional, right? So we have this notion of rationality which kind of seems to cover everything, so where I would go with this in terms of how you go positively is to not think about how we're naturally rational, because we're not, obviously. Not have a cult of enlightenment, where cult of enlightenment just means my interests are right and the rest of yours are irrational, which is what it tends to mean. And not to have a belief in systems which generate rationality for us. So there have been two levels of this faith. One is that the market is going to make us all rational, right? And the other layer on top of that, which kind of mixed in, is that the internet was going to make us all rational, right? And it's not just that that's wrong, but it's displacing, it's putting trust in these external things which don't really have any reality. So I would say that the funny thing about our century so far, which is a century in this lecture anyway. It's a century of the digital oracle and the carbon sacrifice. Like, that's our century so far. The irony of it is that it's all been allowed by this notion of rationality, like a century in which we're all becoming, forgive me, not you, you're all lovely people, and your eyes shine with intelligence, but in a century in which we're all becoming more stupid and pagan. The irony is that it's been covered by this notion that we're rational, and at least that I'm rational. And the funny thing, as I tried to say along the way, is that like this round of paganism is actually a lot less interesting than the last round. Like, when you compare our stories to their stories are much better, right? Mm-hmm. And indeed, insofar as we have stories, we're plagiarizing their stories, right? I mean, Disney only exists. Well, okay, I'm not going to push that too far, but our stories plagiarize their stories, and their stories are really interesting. Their stories are good. Our stories are not, and they're also more beautiful than we are. Right? Like, if you compare the things they were buried with to the things that our rich people wear, it's not even remotely close, right? The things, like most of the things which are dug up from Viking era archaeological sites are women's jewelry. That's most of it, numerically, and it's some pretty lovely stuff. Okay, I should go down a bit of a tangent here, but so their stories are better. Their stories are more beautiful. Their objects were more beautiful. What I'm trying to say is that we mask it in a very narrow idea of rationality, and what we need is a notion of freedom, which is a notion of rationality, which is fundamentally reflective. So this was all an exercise in reflection. I was saying, hey guys, let's look at the 9th century, and maybe in that mirror we'll see ourselves, right? Like, let me take a mirror to the 9th century, let me do this with it, do this with it, do this with it, do this with it, and then maybe we'll see ourselves. It's an exercise in reflection, which, as I was trying to insist at the end, you can only really do with the humanities, right? Without the history of literature and archaeology and all this stuff, you don't have a mirror. You can't build a mirror. You can't build a mirror to the 9th century with the stuff that you know in the 21st. You have to have these humanities. So a notion of rationality which is more reflective, which reflects off all kinds of other things, which allows us to become self-aware of our tendency to make these sacrifices, our capacities for cognitive addiction, all these things which have been true of us as a species ever since we've left records. If we can become aware of these things and give names to them, and not just say, like, I'm smarter than you, or my people are rational, or whatever, then we can see these problems for what they are, right? So I seriously do think, like, this is not, I'm not exactly sure what status this has, honestly, but I do seriously believe that you can't understand global warming by saying it's a whole lot of, like, economic miscalculations, or it's a problem of collective action. I think there is in fact an element of human sacrifice in it. I think there is a self-destructive element in it, and if we don't see that, then we're not being rational. Right, and the way that this would generally work now would be that, an Exxon executive or whoever else is on the panel, we were going to have an Exxon executive here, but at the last moment they pulled out, would say, Professor Snyder, you're being crazy and irrational. You're talking about Odin and, like, all this stuff. You're irrational, but everything's rational, right? But I think the everything is rational kind of got us to where we are today, and like a rationality which was based upon some more reflectiveness would say, well, we tend to get ourselves into these fixes. We tend to be addicted to this kind of stimulation. We have actually sacrificed one another in the past. We do sort of operate like this. And if we know that, we can get, because the one advantage that we have, like we're less beautiful, our stories are worse. But one advantage we do have over people 1,000 years ago is we know about people 1,000 years ago. Right, that's the one advantage we have. And we have that knowledge because of the humanities, which was my pitch at the end. So. That was a big answer. I have little answers too, but I got a
front row. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Polina. I'm a Ukrainian art historian, and I have one question which is a bit provocative, and I have to say that I'm from these people who don't really buy not the argument but the comparison. So for me, this provocative question is about, like, for me, I think while we were speaking about this kind of scheme, I was interested in how do you position yourself in it? Because it's also, I think, about charisma and value and the role of public intellectual during wartime. So if you can reflect on it, in a way, I would be very grateful.
I mean, I can reflect on it, but I'm not sure, honestly, how representative this moment would be for that. So, I mean, with respect to Ukraine and the war, there's been an awful lot of very basic work to be done with other kinds of audiences than this one. Televised audiences, media audiences, political audiences. There's been an awful lot of work to be done in the English and the German languages about some of the very basic factual issues, and also on the issue of Ukrainian subjectivity. The being public, for me at least, has been incidental to that, or it's been a means rather than an end. I would very happily I do some things in private, but I would very happily do all of it, in private if I could. But you can't really. Some of it has to be in public, in various ways. It makes a difference whether you're if I give a lecture to 700 Germans, that's different than tweeting or having a conversation with my best friend in Berlin or whatever it might be. So, I mean, one reflection would be that being public is sometimes a means to an end, that there's you're serving a communicative function in which your body is somehow necessary, and so it's there. Charisma, you may have me boxed in there in a number of different ways, because so my definition of charisma here was the ability, it was entirely negative. It was the ability to, and what I had in mind was precisely, Odinic charisma, or the ability to create a world in which somebody else's sacrifice is necessary for the sake of, my victory, my wealth, the continuity of my cults, whatever it might be. And so then if your question is, can there be such a positive definition of charisma? It's interesting. I mean, I'm borrowing, I didn't do this as a kind of intellectual history thing, but obviously I was thinking along with, and some of you probably recognize this, but I was going back to Weber and Durkheim and René Girard, those are sort of they were my crew when I was thinking about this stuff. And so, charisma for Weber functions a bit the way that I was talking about. You need it until you get to that. You need it when I hand out the rings, right? In ancient Kiev, archaeologists have literally found the gold rings that people would hand out, right? And that was not just it's not a monetary transaction, it's a charismatic transaction. You belong to my retinue. After our triumph, I give you a ring. It's nice that you have it, but also it binds the two of us together. It's a charismatic interaction, and then you get to a point where, in fact, you have contracts and you have institutions and so on, and that kind of interaction is no longer needed. That's Weber, and I'm kind of working with that. But in terms of positive charisma, that's a really good question you're asking me to reflect on. I mean, I think it's, I guess there's a charisma of making things make sense.
Social cohesion.
Yeah. I mean, there's I'm just gonna. This is all I'm going to say, because I don't have strong thoughts about this, and I don't want to take up all the time. But I think there's a charisma of making things make sense, and that charisma is largely absent. And a joke, you guys were very polite and you laughed at my jokes. That was very nice. You laughed at that one too. A joke is one way of making sense. I never obviously plan my jokes. You can tell, I'm sure, from but a joke is one way of making sense. It only is funny because of all the things that we just were experiencing together, right? The things that were jokes in this talk, if I told them out of context, they would just be ridiculous. But because we've gone through the same process together, then they're funny. And so I think that things can be more things can be made sense of than we think, and that there is a kind of charisma to that. I think it's like when people talk to me, like after I've been on TV, or when Ukrainians when Ukrainians walk up to me in Ukraine and say, "Oh, thanks for your lectures. Like I now understand this." I think that has to do with that. It's like the charisma of making a kind of sense of things, and I think it's a charisma which is missing a bit, So like this whole public intellectual thing, like I have to say, like I'm kind of allergic to the topic. Like I kind of want to run away from it, just like I would really like to run away from being one. But that's like I think it does have to do with like the physicality of making sense. The physicality of making sense. The presence of sense making. I think is I'm sure it's not an entirely innocent form of charisma, but it's a different form of charisma.
There was a gentleman there I saw halfway through, yes.
Thank you. My name is Martin Sumer. I'm a research economist. I think, Timothy, how I understood your lecture is that you started by saying, if you look at the world today, political movements and some personalities like Putin, Trump, and Elon Musk, you talked then just about the personalities, we have a hard time explaining this by conventional arguments we are used to, interests, rationality, or something. And then you say, like, if we assume, let's assume we take a pagan mindset and look at this phenomena, people again, suddenly things start to fall into place and make a lot of sense. But what you did not explain is, like, what is the mechanism that make this, pagan paradigms or behavior more prevalent, more plausible, or is this something new, or was this not there before, or what caused this transition? So I did not hear an answer in your reflections, like how we had this transition from something to this. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah. I was on the charisma question. My children say Riz, my children say Riz. Like it's like charisma has its own kind of internet avatar, which is Riz, as in like, Dad, I think you got the W Riz, which is like nicest thing my son's ever said to me. Yeah, no, quite right. I mean, that's more than I could do, but I think I suggested some things. There were some causal arrows here of things that have changed. Just to name two, like the things that I was talking about are actually things which have changed over the last 30 years. So wealth concentration has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, especially in Russia and the United States and some other places. And I do think that their quantity does become quality. Like at a certain, like if the richest people in your country have $500 million, that's one thing. But when they have $200 billion, that's already a different thing. Like that's already wealth which exceeds that of many countries, and and you think of, like, it's easier to think of them as gods at that point, because and to hope for them to hope that they'll behave like gods, that they'll have favor upon you, right? That they will heed your sacrifice, at least the sacrifice of the 18 hours of your day that you spent in front of their platform, that they will, I think at that level, things change. At a certain point, they change. And for me, it does have to do with the accumulation of wealth, because it's not like, and it's a relationship, because it's not as though, it's not about how people are poorer. It's about the emergence it's about the fact that, I'm slightly making this up and you can all correct me, but roughly, half the wealth in my country is owned by people, like, it could be owned by you, it isn't, but like it's roughly it's this number of people in a couple more rooms, right? That's weird. And it means that those people are in fact in a different position than everyone else. they're in a different position than people who have $1 million or $10 million. If you have $1 billion or $10 billion, you're in an objectively different position, and you're also like you're in this level where there is no level above you. Like that's it. Like you're past the point where the money even makes sense, and so you're in this sort of ethereal plane where you're with other people, not really quite sure what to do, which is another aspect of this tragedy. Is that in general they have no idea what to do, and they're unhappier than middle class people, but. So that's part of it. And then tech is also the change in technology, right? So 30 years ago, we were not spending, Americans now spend 14 hours a day in front of, oh, no, sorry, I don't want to exaggerate. Americans now spend 9 hours a day in front of screens. That's a lot of time, right? That's a lot of time, more time than we sleep. And that didn't used to be true. Like sleep used to be number one, and now screen staring is number one. And that's a very different corporeality. It's a very different relationship. And I think like that itself justifies asking these big questions. So like when I call the phone an oracle, you can go many other ways with this, but I do think that the phone is a qualitative change, like the bottomlessness of it, right? Like the way that it's not a tool because it's not directed at doing any particular thing, right? It's rather that there's a bottomlessness of what it might be able to do for you. That's new, right? Like, and the way that instead of allowing you to do things, it actually makes you less capable in almost every aspect of life, right? That's new. And so those are two of the changes, like those are two of the mechanisms. And it goes to your question, like in terms of what one could do on a micro scale, like on a political scale, the United States really needs to tax people. That's what the state is there for in the first place. Like when one talks about the transitions from these kinds of political orders to other kinds of political orders, being able to tax people is pretty close to the top of what that transition means. Keeping screens out of schools, like keeping screens away from children in your own life, keeping screens away from, like those are the kinds of things one can do, which would actually push us back a little bit.
I see your hand there, yes.
Hi, hello, my name is Alexandra Skawronska, and I would like to thank you for your insight regarding the oligarchs that are taking the earth with them. That was very insightful and inspiring, and I think it also says that Christianity doesn't work if you're like rich enough.
Sorry, what doesn't work?
Christian values don't work if like you're surpassing a certain level of being rich. And I have two questions. The first one is, because you use word "we" a lot, and I wanted to ask, who is "we" in your lecture? Are we like supporters of liberal democracy or someone else? Because I think it's good to define how do we define ourselves. And the second question, a little bit more detailed. You said that Trump supporters they do create a god by support him. And my question would be, wasn't there a void for this kind of god-like person to be filled? If not Trump, would be there someone else that would play the similar role? Yeah. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
So on the second one, the basic historian's answer would be that yes, there's a structural place, but there's also contingency. If Barack Obama hadn't made fun of Donald Trump, it's very possible he never would have run for president. And I don't think at this particular conjuncture there were other people in the United States with that talent set. He is very talented, just as I'm sure whoever the original Odin was, if there was a person, was very talented. Donald Trump he's quite talented. He's very good at doing what he's doing. He's very good at it right now. The Democrats who try to tell you that he's like mentally unfit and he's about to fall over dead, that's, not true. He's very talented. He's good at what he's doing. He's doing it well. And I don't actually think there was another American who could have been slotted in at that time. But I agree with you structurally. It's just that there's also contingency. I think that the wealth inequality actually created the possibility for a story like his, which is of a winner-loser. He's a winner-loser. So he's somebody who loses all the time, but somehow wins. And for people who are themselves losing more often than they should be according to the American dream, the idea that you can be a loser winner, that somehow miraculously it's all going to come together for you, at least if you're a white guy, that's a very attractive thing, and that's part of what makes Trump possible. But again, it's the inequality, I think, which creates that drama. And then technology. He's a brilliant user of technology. He was very good at understanding what you could do with Twitter, very good at understanding what you could do with short messages. And before Twitter, you couldn't have had a Trump, I don't think. Like Trump is a good example of what Twitter allows an individual to do with the minds of millions of other individuals. Now I've forgotten the first part of your question.
Who are we?
We are followers of the digital oracle and sacrificers of carbon. That's who we are. That's my we in this lecture. If there's any of you who believes that you're not one of those things, let me know.
Right at the back there, I see a hand.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a really interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first one is the first two things that you mentioned. I wonder if they kind of contradict each other a little bit, because you said that on the one hand they believe that they may be immortal, but on the other hand they will take the world with them. Wouldn't they want to keep the world alive if they believe themselves to be immortal? And the second point would be, I wonder, since you mentioned that a lot of stories are beautiful and we lack that kind of beauty at the moment, do you think that there is a sort of global lack of beautiful stories and people might be clinging to something that can only be found in something that we all share, which is money, which is power for people who have a lot of money? So I wonder if this sort of necessarily becomes a new class of heroes that we need to look up to in a way.
Mm. I think that I love the second question, and it's something that there's a version of that in which I believe, and I'd like to believe in stronger versions of it too. It has to do a little bit with what I was trying to insist on about the humanities, and it also comes back to your question that I was obviously struggling with about charisma. There's an artfulness to doing things, right? In another version of this talk, I was only going to do Greek tragedies before I decided to do the Scandinavians, and I couldn't do it all. But like all the same issues, you could do this whole lecture with the Greek tragedies instead of the Scandinavians. But there's an artfulness to theater. There's an artfulness to giving a lecture, but that artfulness is not necessarily inconsistent with the truth. On the contrary, the artfulness may be the thing which allows you to see, and that's, my views on art are not very sophisticated, but it seems to me that what art often allows us to do is to see the unseen obvious, right? It's the thing which allows us to, de-alienate what's been alienated. It's the thing which it gives us this point of view to see the thing which really we should have already seen, but without art we can't see it. And so I think beauty can be enlivening in that way. Not only human beauty, but also natural beauty. I think a lot of the things that you and I might call stories are deeply rooted in lost knowledge of what wind and grass sounds like, or lost knowledge of what coyotes look like. I think a lot of stories depend upon common human references which we've wiped out as we've wiped out the other species. We now outweigh all the other mammals. I didn't mean that personally. It's just like as a species, and the people, the livestock that we have. I forget the numbers, but it's something horrifyingly like the livestock outweigh the wild animals by a horrifying factor. So the way that we put all that under control is ugly. It's physically ugly, but it also cuts us off from an ability to tell stories. So I think that you're right that and this is this has been very true, by the way, of my experience of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture in the last 10 years, which in some way stands behind, I'm sure, a lot of these arguments, that it's it's the plastic artists and the poets who are often cutting to the chase the most quickly. That it's not the tweets and the news reports. It's often the poets and the sculptors who are cutting to the chase. And if you figure out what they're doing, then sometimes the rest of it comes into focus. So I think something like that is definitely right. But when we talk about, like in my version of paganism, I was kind of saying again and again that our version is worse, and I think the oracle is worse, in that the other oracle, to take the Greek oracles, Delphi or whatever, they might tell you something which is obscure and false, but they set you on your way. Mm-hmm. They set you on, and then you would go off and then you go off and commit incest or whatever. But like they set you on your way, and a story followed. A story followed, and within what they said there was an ambiguity, but it could be a pregnant ambiguity, right? It could lead somewhere. Whereas the oracle that we have now tends not to give us stories. It tends to, this is just everybody knows this, but it shortens our attention span to the point where it's hard to take stories in anymore. And I think that is a great loss. And I think the word heroism that you use is appropriate here, because I think there's something actually, like, as a historian, I really admire novelists because for 100 reasons, but one of them is just now the wherewithal to do implotment, all the way to the end. I think there's a kind of heroism in that now, and so yes, I'm basically agreeing with you. Was there another part of your question which I've overlooked? Just yell. What was it?
Thank you. The first part of the question was if there might be a bit of a contradiction between...
Oh, right.
Yeah. And I wonder, I forgot this the first time, if some kind of idea of legacy plays into this.
Yeah. I find... So again, what I'm struck by is the impoverishment of our notion of immortality now. So what we mean by immortality now is like this body and this life is just going to kind of keep going, which I think is kind of not just boring, but sort of inherently horrifying. I don't want this life and this body to go on indefinitely. Like, that's not what it's here for. It's not structured for that. But it's not beautiful. Like, it's ugly. It's simple. Whereas there are other ideas of immortality, like the Viking idea of immortality is not just Valhalla, which I was kind of joking about as a place, but it was also the idea of renown. That, and in the poetry, this appears again and again and again. And indeed, that's what a lot of the skaldic poetry was for. The poetry itself was regarded as the immortality. If I remembered my Edda slightly better, I could cite some bits of this, but the very idea of renown was regarded as immortality. Like, people die. I'm now vaguely paraphrasing some things. People die, animals die, people die. What doesn't die is renown, right? What other people can say about you in art, precisely, right? And that's a notion of immortality, and it's an interesting notion of immortality, the idea that you'll be remembered for what you do. And of course, it has its downside, because it may lead you to exaggerate the violence in this life so that you can be remembered later on. But it's an interesting notion of immortality. I agree with you that it's confused. I'm not trying to say that their notion of immortality and hoarding makes a whole lot of sense. I don't think they think they're going to be making a shift from, so they don't, I think they think they're just going to be around indefinitely. And if you're going to be around indefinitely, then you would need an indefinite amount of money. And so it's a simpler idea of immortality, which leads to a simpler kind of hoarding. But I'm not dedicated to making this make sense 100% for them.
Tim, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. In fact, we've gone over. I know we could go on all night, but things have to move on, and we can all go off and do things now in response to this. We've heard the oracle, and so it only remains for you to join me in giving Tim Snyder a rousing round of applause.